Hey everybody, Trey here, back with another forecast discussion for today's severe weather event across parts of the southeast into the mid-south. The SPC, since our last discussion, has expanded the enhanced risk level 3 out of 5 in the orange shaded region here. So basically all the way up from western Tennessee southward through southeast Arkansas, northern portions of Louisiana, all of Mississippi into western Alabama and the western Florida panhandle. So a very broad enhanced risk. They have expanded that region since our last discussion a couple of days ago. Some things have changed with the setup. The overall forecast remains on track, but we're going to go over some of the new data that we have in this morning, as well as some of the model data that is coming in as we speak to see how this event will progress into the overnight hours tonight. So, folks in the orange shaded region there in the greatest threat for severe weather, the reason for this enhanced risk is mainly for the threat for strong tornadoes. The threat is going to be highest in the yellow hatched region here, so western Tennessee, those same areas we already mentioned, western Tennessee, southeast Arkansas, northern Louisiana, Mississippi, into parts of western and southwest Alabama, under the gun for the greatest threat for tornadoes, perhaps a couple of strong tornadoes as well. 2 and 5% areas surrounding that, all the way up. 2% goes all the way up into Kentucky and over into central Georgia and East Texas as well. So broad area of tornado risk today, perhaps a couple of strong tornadoes within the yellow stippled region. And then the other reason for the enhanced is for some significant damaging winds. Large 30% area for damaging winds with a hatched area that has now been added from western Tennessee southwestward through the Mississippi River Delta area. Chance for some significant damaging wind gusts in excess of 60, 70, even possibly 80 miles an hour with this setup. Large hail not going to be much of an issue, but could see some isolated large hailstones within the broader risk area today. So that is the outlook for now. Before we continue, I also want to mention the flash flooding and excessive rainfall threat today. It is at a level 4 out of 4 high risk in the pink shaded region there. So northwest Tennessee, the Missouri boot heel, northeastward through much of western to central Kentucky. You are under the gun for some significant excessive rainfall and significant flash flooding today. There's already been quite a bit of rain that has fallen across these areas. And so folks out here, in especially the red and pink areas. Red is the moderate level 3 out of 4 area, broad area for that as well, northeast Arkansas up into West Virginia. Very broad swath of folks under the gun for some significant rainfall and flash flooding today. So turn around, don't drown, stay safe today. But let's go ahead and turn to our severe threat for today. That's what we do on this channel, of course, but wanted to make you aware of the flash flooding risk that has already begun with this system. So let's take a look at what's going on right now. As we speak, we have quite a bit of rain and thunderstorm activity across Arkansas, northeastward through Tennessee and Kentucky. You can see why we've already seen the start of this flash flooding threat across these areas, just precipitation training across parts of Tennessee into Kentucky. And that is going to continue through the day, expecting a bit more activity here on the trailing southwestern edge of this ongoing area of showers and storms. And this is going to be north of the warm front in some fairly cool air, so not expecting this to be severe at all. Again, the heavy rainfall threat is going to be the greatest threat with this activity throughout the morning hours. We will watch later on going into the mid to late afternoon hours here across the southwestern flanks of this ongoing convection for our surface-based event that is expected to begin around that time frame. But for now, not much going on. We are seeing quite a bit of activity north of the warm front, and if we get a lot of activity here to regenerate to the north of the warm front, that may keep the overall warm front farther south than expected. A lot of the models have the warm front getting pretty far north. We'll show you that here in just a second. But if we get a lot of activity, a lot of elevated activity north of the front, then that is going to keep that warm front a little bit farther south, and that warm front, of course, delineates the northward extent of the overall severe threat here across the southeast. Here's our visible satellite imagery right now. Quite a bit of cloud cover across the area. Really not a lot of clearing at all here, except right along the Louisiana coast. Expecting that we should see some breaks in the clouds later on today to allow for at least some filtered heating and modest destabilization with this event. Earlier model runs a few days ago were showing that we were going to have a pretty robust instability environment with this setup. That is a little bit in question at this point, given the overall lack of surface heating and perhaps the stubborn nature of the cloud cover going into later today. If we get more cloud cover than we are expecting, then we might see a little bit more instability. If clouds hang around pretty stubbornly, then we will not see real strong destabilization, and therefore just some modest instability with this event. 500 to 1,000 joules per kilogram seems about right, but if we get a little bit more sunshine and surface heating, that could be a little bit higher, better chance for more robust updrafts. But right now, not expecting a ton of heating here, just some filtered heating across these the Gulf Coast states within the risk area, and perhaps even farther north as if we get some breaks in the clouds up there as well. All right, upper air maps. Let's go ahead and take a look at our 500 millibar map here. Here is our trough of note. You see the kink in the height contours here associated with a pretty potent jet streak rounding the base of that trough. It is quite a positively tilted trough, as we talked about in our video a couple of days ago. A lot of the models were progging a little bit of a sheared out, positively tilted trough accompanying this system, and that has been the case so far. The models have come around a little bit in changing the geometry of the trough to a little bit more favorable for severe weather. The problem is how far back this trough is at this point. The axis here, if we were to draw the axis as we have right through the base of the quote-unquote ski jump, if you will, it is well back here. Far west Texas, eastern New Mexico, Texas and Oklahoma Panhandle region into western Kansas. So we are well back. And again, our area of interest for today is in here. So we're going to have to get that all the way off to the east to really start impacting the region. And that shouldn't occur until later this afternoon into evening. So we're going to remain in a fairly weakly forced environment across the warm sector as it advances northward. And that has been the main concern for me with this setup as far as the potential for prefrontal open warm sector supercells. As we've always talked about on this channel, prefrontal open warm sector supercells hold the greatest threat for significant severe weather in these events. When you have a broad warm sector and you can get these confluence bands amid the warm advection regime with that warm moist air transporting inland, that can help initiate storms. But if you don't have forcing across the warm sector on the synoptic scale with an incoming trough or shortwave, then those storms are really going to struggle, and they're not going to be able to reach their full potential. And that is exactly what we're dealing with this setup. This trough is going to hang pretty far back for much of the day. Really just a very glancing blow at best across this area for as far as forcing goes. And so I don't think we're going to have enough forcing to initiate storms in the open warm sector during the day. And even into the early evening hours tonight. So that is a good thing with this setup as far for the folks in these regions, that we're not expecting a robust open warm sector supercell threat, and that should keep the overall significant tornado risk down a little bit with this setup. Still, kinematics are very strong with this setup, especially as the trough does move in later this evening into tonight and the overnight hours. And so we could still see some strong tornado threat materialize within the storms back along the frontal zone, but we'll get to that here in just a second. But overall, the threat for warm sector supercell is going to remain fairly limited, at least for much of the day into the early evening hours, because of a lack of forcing over the open warm sector. But this trough will eventually swing through, provide a lot more forcing for storms, and this should provide quite a bit of forcing in this setup, and that is one piece of evidence we have for this setup being more of a QLCS squall line type deal. Again, we'll get into that here in just a second. Up at 300 millibars, not seeing much defluence in the exit region of this trough. Not all that surprising given the geometry of the trough being slightly more positively tilted. Not a ton of defluence in the exit region of the trough. Again, defluence, as we've talked about before, is the spreading apart of those wind vectors in the upper levels of the atmosphere. That creates a void, and that allows for rising motion to fill that void. That's how we get large-scale ascent in these setups. Not a ton of defluence in the exit region of this trough. Some modest defluence perhaps here, but again, hanging well back, not going to overspread our area of interest until much later in the day into this evening, and that is going to keep forcing at a minimum across the open warm sector here for areas as farther east especially. We will have that cold front setting up here across East Texas, and that will help things get going as the trough starts to inch its way in by mid to late afternoon. Down at the surface, let's take a look at what the surface is showing. We've seen at least broad cyclogenesis thus far. A very windy day in the central and southern plains yesterday, and that was due to our cyclogenesis processes that had already started across the central high plains. We've seen the surface low kind of just remain fairly broad up until this point. It is expected to consolidate a little bit and deepen as it moves off to the northeast into the Mississippi River Valley region later on today, we should see a strengthening of that surface low a little bit, and that will provide for the track of the surface low. And because we've already had these winds flip around to southerly, pulling that moisture northward, we've already seen some of that warm sector get established across inland areas of the southeast states. That should allow for a continued northward advance of the warm sector, pending the amount of convection we see to the north of the frontal zone. But if we don't see a ton, that warm sector, that warm front is going to manage its way pretty far north up here, and the SPC has it basically up here into western Tennessee, southeast Arkansas, and areas to the south being our warm sector. So pretty far northward advance of robust moisture in this setup, given the overall track and nature of the surface low. That again is expected to deepen as we go into the afternoon hours today. 850 millibar analysis, pretty strong low-level jet across the region. That is going to continue, given that we will continue to see the deepening of the surface cyclone. We see 40, 50, 60-plus knots of flow out here from Texas all the way into the Midwestern regions here, southern Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, southward, very strong low-level jet. That is expected to continue through the day, and that will allow that low-level moisture to continue to pump northward into the region, establishing that broad warm sector, and it will allow for very strong low-level shear through the day. That is a pretty saving grace with this setup, is that we're not going to see a lot of forcing in the warm sector to sustain warm sector supercells, because low-level shear with this low-level jet remaining through the day is going to be quite strong. And so the fact that we don't have supercells in the warm sector to take advantage of that, as it is looking likely at this point, is a good sign for folks living in these areas, because that would they would pose the greatest threat for some significant tornadoes if we did have them, those storms fire. But lack of forcing is not going to be able to allow storms to tap any storms that form, which is a very big if, to tap into this environment. But back along the front, we will have still very strong low-level shear with this low-level jet, and so storms along the frontal zone as they form will pose a risk for that damaging wind and tornado risk as well. All right, here's some of our raw surface data as we speak. Let me refresh it to get the most up-to-date data for you. So here we are. Here we see a lot of these filled circles, a lot of pink filled circles here. That is indicative of a lot of cloud cover. And again, what we saw in our satellite imagery, very broad, low-level cloud cover. It is foggy here in Norman as I'm recording this, so lots of cloud cover across the region today. How we see any breaks in the clouds develop into the afternoon is going to be important as far as destabilizing the atmosphere. But we see a little bit of cyclonic curvature here out across this kind of northwest Texas vicinity here. So our surface low is centered probably somewhere in here in northwest Texas, south of Childress, in the Throckmorton-Seymour vicinity here of northwest Texas. And again, that is expected to consolidate and deepen a little bit as we go into the day today. It will move off to the northeast, pulling that warm sector north with it. We see where our most robust moisture is at this time. Mid-60s dew points all the way up into northern Louisiana and southern Arkansas at this point. 70s dew points lingering, upper 60s and 70s dew points lingering across Louisiana into southeast Texas. Let's shift over to our southeast sector here. And we see that warm sector is extending pretty far off to the east with 70s dew points there in far southern Alabama, the Mobile, Fairhope area. And so our warm sector pretty broad at this point with 60s dew points all the way into the Florida Panhandle region. So our most robust moisture confined here at this point to these areas here, Louisiana, far east Texas, much of Louisiana, southern Mississippi, pretty much south of the Jackson area into far southern Alabama at this point. Again, that is going to continue to make its way north for a broad warm sector. Lots of real estate here to support a longer duration severe threat once these storms develop later on this afternoon. All right, let's take a look at some soundings now to analyze our environment in the warm sector at this point. We'll start off at Lake Charles, so far southwest Louisiana, right in here. And so a couple things to notice right now. We already have some instability in place, about 900 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE. Not much capping already in this environment. Very weak capping here. You can see mixed layer convective inhibition pretty much at zero at this point. So this usually would be a positive in terms of allowing storms in the open warm sector to go, given that we have a weak cap that wouldn't take a lot for updrafts to go. So but the fact that we do not have forcing in the warm sector to allow storms to go up is going to be a precluding factor for storm development in the warm sector, even with this weak capping inversion. But still, this is going to allow storms to fire pretty easily back to the west along the cold frontal zone as it develops with the surface low later on into the afternoon today. And so that'll be our main initiating boundary for storms. That cold front, as the low lifts north, it will allow for that cold front to really develop, and that will be our main initiating mechanism for storms in this environment. But in the open warm sector, where we don't really have that convergence along the frontal boundary, not going to be enough to get storms to go, despite the weak capping in play. Very moist surface air mass, some drier air right above that. Would expect that to deepen going through the day, as we're going to have strong warm convection ongoing in the low levels throughout the much of the day today, given the strengthening of the surface low. Kinematics, deep layer shear not quite there yet, given the fact that the trough is lagging far behind. Deep layer shear not quite ready yet to support severe storms, with effective shear right at the margins for severe storms there at about 30 knots or so. And low-level shear, though, is somewhat amplified at this point. 40-knot, 1-kilometer winds, evidence of that stronger low-level jet, but not much turning of those low-level winds with height. But that is going to change as we get that low-level jet to really entrench itself across the warm sector today. Those photographs are going to be quite large, supporting the threat for tornadoes, perhaps some strong, even with a QLCS mode being the favored mode here. Off to the east at Slidell, 69 over 67 at the surface. Not much instability to speak of here, so the instability corridor pretty confined at this point. Again, that is going to expand, especially where breaks in the clouds are observed later on today. Low-level curvature here in the photograph much stronger at Slidell here. Evidence of that low-level jet, deep layer shear, again, still on the margins out here at Slidell. So the warm sector pretty far from being ready to support severe storms at this point. So that is going to allow for mostly probably storms initiating at the earliest, probably mid-afternoon or so, 2 to 3 p.m. at the earliest, once we get some destabilization to occur across the region. Up here at Jackson, we are north of the warm front. Strong warm convection ongoing, as you see here by the low-level curvature in the photograph. Strong veering and strengthening of the winds with height. And so this is the type of photograph that is going to encompass the warm sector later on today, which is why we have that strong tornado risk in place. Instability at this point, though, not quite ready across these regions to support a severe threat. All right, here is our NAM model that is coming in right now. So we'll take a look at how this event is expected to progress. Here we'll start at 500 millibars. And you see our trough pretty clearly. The base of the trough right there in kind of northwest Mexico, positively tilted, somewhat of a sheared out trough at this point, given that sheared out look there. But that is going to change into the day today. As we go on into the afternoon hours today, you see that trough really consolidate. This is at 21Z, 3 p.m. And you see a much more defined trough, still slightly positively tilted here, but a much more defined trough. A couple days ago, that was not the case. Let me go back a couple of model runs here. We'll go back to the morning on the 13th. You see at the same time, we saw a much more sheared out, very, not really super well-defined trough. And I'll go back here to our sector. So this is our old model runs. This is our new model run. You see an amplification of the trough that has occurred with the last several model runs going into this morning's model run. And so usually that would mean a more robust setup for forcing, more robust shear for severe storms. But look at where the trough is compared to where our warm sector is expected to be. Warm sector expected to be here, warm front up into western Tennessee, southeast Arkansas, down into east Texas and eastward. We're not even really being touched by the trough at this point. The exit region of the trough still well back here across Oklahoma and Texas. And so we're just not going to have any forcing over the warm sector, it looks like, to support warm sector development here through the day. You go on toward 0Z as well. We start to get some of that stronger flow aloft impinging upon the region. And that is when things are going to start to take shape, especially along the cold front. We'll start to see that trough, that exit region of the trough, really move over that region where the cold front is located. And so that is going to be where our storms initiate they're going to be most pervasive, where that forcing is strongest along the cold front and where the synoptic forcing is strongest as that trough moves in. The warm sector, still not a ton going on here in the warm sector off to the east. So through the early evening hours, not expecting to see much warm sector supercell development. Going into the evening hours, though, we start to see the trough take on much more of a neutral tilt here. Still slightly positively tilted, but a little bit more neutral tilt. But you see those stronger winds finally starting to overspread the warm sector. So the question here going into the overnight hours, this is at midnight tonight. is if we'll get warm sector development later on this evening. The warm sector is expected to remain fairly broad here, especially across southern portions of the risk area, southern Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and the SPC has increased tornado probabilities for this area. And so once this forcing moves in, it'll be interesting to see if we get any confluence bands, and with that extra synoptic forcing introduced into the region, will we be able to see robust warm sector supercells take shape before the cold front crashes in and we get that squall line to really take over. So that is one of the questions with this setup. We're going to just have to monitor as we go into this evening. But for much of the day, not expecting to see a lot of warm sector supercell development at all, given the lack of forcing. But the forcing will increase overnight here, leading to an intensification and continuation of the squall line. But we'll have to watch that area of southern Mississippi and Alabama into the Florida Panhandle for the threat for some possible prefrontal supercells as forcing on the synoptic scale increases tonight into the early morning hours tomorrow. Then we get that trough to move out. Could see some severe storms continue into the eastern seaboard tomorrow afternoon. SPC has a marginal risk up for their low-end risk, probably due to weak instability, but that risk could persist through the afternoon tomorrow before things move out late Sunday afternoon. All right, let's go down to the surface here. So our surface map, we'll keep it on the broad sector at this point. Broad surface low that we're dealing with right now, not a very consolidated one, but again, that is expected to change. And you see that change as we go on through the day. We see a nice surface low start to be centered there right in the western Tennessee vicinity, just north of Memphis, and that will allow that warm sector to get all the way that far north. You see the warmer temperatures there delineating the warm sector, fairly broad warm sector, especially with southern extent. With northern extent, it should get pinched off fairly quickly as the cold front moves in. As that stronger forcing moves in, that cold front is going to start to really surge off to the east and southeast. And so the warm sector should get pinched with time with northward extent. As we go to our moisture field here in a second, we'll see that a little bit better. But much stronger surface low than a couple of days ago as well. I'll go back to our model run a couple of days ago. You see a much more strung out, much weaker surface low here, not very as tight of a pressure gradient there associated with that surface low. But that has changed with a little bit of change for the little bit of improvement in the geometry of the upper level trough. That has led to a much stronger surface low here to allow for a slightly farther northward advance of the warm sector with this event. But still, again, forcing expected to remain minimal across the warm sector, and that cold front, see that sharp temperature gradient there, that is expected to be our main initiating boundary in this setup. Then we go into the overnight hours. That low continues to deepen, and then it'll move off quickly to the northeast. Cold front moves through, and we sweeps out into the Atlantic by late afternoon to early evening tomorrow. Let's go down to the zoomed in sector here in the southern plains to take a look at our moisture fields. As we saw, the most robust moisture confined to far southern portions of these Gulf Coast states at this point. Not all that surprising, but that is going to continue to advect northward pretty quickly going on into the afternoon today. This is at 18Z, so midday, lunchtime today. Broad warm sector, that moisture gradient really starting to take shape here to the east. Cold front, though, is a little bit lagging to farther back to the west of that, it looks like. The actual cold front looks to be back probably in here somewhere as that surface low develops, but the actual gradient is right in there out across portions of far east Texas into southern Arkansas. So that should be our main initiating boundary. Again, probably by this point, still not ready to support robust convective development. We'll have a lot going on to the north of the frontal zone here, but overall in the warm sector, that should remain fairly quiet through much of the day until we get that cold front to really swing through into the afternoon hours today. Probably storm development by this time along this moisture gradient, the actual temperature gradient swinging through as well, going into the evening hours. You see the NAM has that warm sector all the way north to the Memphis area by 21Z, 3 p.m., and a little bit farther north going into 0Z, which is 6 p.m. this evening. You can see what we were talking about with the warm sector being a little bit pinched off to the north. It's kind of more of a triangular shape here with our warm sector. So much less real estate up here to the north, much broader down to the south to support convection. And so areas to the north, as that cold front swings through and really starts to surge, you'll see it really start to surge here as we go into the overnight hours. That cold front catches up, the forcing catches up, and that really pushes that cold front off to the east by early evening this evening. And then we'll see that threat continue mostly for southern portions of the risk area. And again, that's what we were talking about. This is at midnight. We still have quite a bit of warm sector to work with here, so we'll have storms ongoing along the front, but also plenty of real estate to support perhaps some open warm sector supercells here moving in off the Gulf going into the nighttime hours and early morning hours tomorrow. So that'll be something to watch closely, as we'll have enough of a warm sector there to support that. Then we go into tomorrow. I'll go into our southeast sector here, and that warm sector gets really pinched off going into tomorrow. If we get perhaps a little bit of instability up here into the eastern seaboard states, that will allow that line to continue, but limited instability should keep the overall threat tomorrow at bay. Okay, let's take a couple of soundings here from across the region. We'll start at 21Z, 3 p.m. We'll take one here to the north, out across the northern portions of the warm sector, and then out here western Louisiana, closer to the actual frontal zone, to show you what the environment is going to look like. Quickly, given our low-level jet is going to remain fairly strong across this region through the day, you see 50, 60, 70 knots of flow out here across the warm sector for much of the day, especially into the evening. That really starts to intensify. That low-level shear is going to be very, very strong, and you see that in the photographs here across the warm sector. This is farther off to the north, so up in the Memphis area. Very strong low-level shear in place. Strong, very rapid strengthening of those winds as you go up in the atmosphere, leading to very impressive curvature in excess of 300 meters squared per second squared, effective storm relative helicity, strong deep layer shear, 50-plus knots of deep layer shear there. So our kinematics not of concern, not poor in the setup, so to speak. We have plenty of wind shear, both in the low levels and in the deep layer, to support significant severe weather today. Instability does look to be adequate, 1,200 or so, 1,300 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE. Strong low-level instability as well. Probably not going to be too much of a concern, given that we don't have a lot of warm sector supercells to take advantage of that, but still could see some spin-ups within the line. But overall, decent instability with very strong kinematic profiles, setting the stage for severe weather here as early as mid-afternoon. Farther off to the south, a little bit of a warm nose that appears to continue through the afternoon with southern extent. That could also be some evidence why warm sector supercells are not expected with this event during the day, especially as this warm nose is expected to maintain itself, at least on this particular model run. That could thwart things, as we saw it kind of thwart things with our last setup a few days ago. So if that hangs around, not much warm sector development at all, but still overall plenty of instability to support robust storms with a kinematic profile that is quite impressive. All right, let's go to 0Z here. So this is going to be at 6 p.m. We'll take a sounding right up here, close to the Memphis area, right at the northern extent of the warm sector. Again, very pinched warm sector up there, so the real estate for severe storms up there, not as great as it is down south. And then we'll take one here, western Louisiana, once again, ahead of the surging cold front. And look at those photographs. That is up, this is again up by Memphis. Northern reaches of the warm sector, very, very strong low-level shear, low-level jet upwards of 70 knots here at 850 millibars with southerly surface winds. That is leading to a really impressive low-level wind profile here with strong deep layer shear to support organized convection. This is why we're seeing that strong tornado risk present itself. Now, the overall shear vectors are not going to be all that favorable for tornadoes here within the line. If we're looking at our low-level shear vectors, 0 to 1 kilometer, 0 to 3 kilometer, 1 to 3 kilometer vectors, they're not all that favorable, it looks like, for a robust quote-unquote tornado printer, as some folks like to call it, QLCS event. So I don't think we're going to see a ton of QLCS circulations with this event, given the overall configuration of the shear vectors with respect to the orientation of the line, which is going to be northeast to southwest. Your low-level shear vectors are much oriented along the line, so that should keep overall your the QLCS tornado threat a little bit lower, but still with such strong low-level shear, there could be several little spin-ups within the line. And with such strong low-level shear, a few of those spin-ups could be strong. Instability is on the weak side here with northern extent, about 1,000 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE, but it is on the skinnier side. So that is going to keep things at bay a little bit as well, but still plenty of instability to support robust updrafts and a strong downward transfer of momentum from above to get those strong winds down to the surface and that tornado risk as well. Farther south, instability is a little bit weak as well, still fairly skinny cape profiles with strong low-level and deep layer shear. So kinematics, no shortage of kinematics here, but the instability will probably wane as we go into the evening hours tonight, but still enough to support a severe threat here. 3Z along the Mississippi River Delta there of southern Mississippi to eastern Louisiana. Instability remains in kind of that area where we talked about later, that range, about 1,300 joules per kilogram, with strong low-level shear. So this environment does persist into the evening hours. Then let's take a look here at 6Z. So this is when we may start to see some warm sector supercells pop up across southern portions of the Gulf Coast states, southeast Louisiana, southern Mississippi, southern Alabama, western Florida Panhandle. This is the environment that we're going to be watching that they are going to go up in. Enough instability to support those updrafts to go up. That warm nose has kind of relieved itself there, with super strong low-level shear, almost 400 meters squared per second squared effective storm relative helicity. So if storms can go in the open warm sector, as forcing moves in and forcing strengthens over the actual warm sector here, ahead of the line of storms along the cold front, we could see some confluence bands start to develop some supercells, and that enough synoptic forcing will be able to allow those to mature and persist here in this environment with enough instability and plenty of low-level and deep layer shear for organized severe storms. So that is something to watch closely. We'll take a look at our cam runs here in a second to see if we have any support for that, but that could be something to watch here, as we'll have a fully destabilized environment with strong low-level and deep layer shear with enough forcing to allow those to happen. The cold front will continue to push that squall line off to the east. That could be very intense as well, with significant damaging winds and embedded tornadoes, but that'll be something to watch here. Southern Mississippi, Alabama, into the western Florida Panhandle, going into the early morning hours tomorrow, and then things kind of get pinched off tomorrow morning for just a very low-end event tomorrow morning, it looks like. All right, let's take a look at some cam runs here. So we'll see if our forecast is confirmed here by these cam runs. This is a 12Z, HRRR. You see all that convection to the north of the warm front. Persist into the afternoon. That is going to persist for quite a while into the afternoon. You see redevelopment of storms there across Arkansas. So that will have some impact on how far north that warm front gets. Still expecting it to get pretty far north into western Tennessee, southeast Arkansas at the very minimum. And that is what the HRRR has here. And then by about mid-afternoon or so, this is 20Z, so this is going to be 2 p.m. Central Standard Time, we start to see stuff developing along that frontal zone, that moisture gradient and / frontal zone back there to the west across East Texas and southern Arkansas. Quickly congeals into a line. Not all that shocking at all. Shear vectors, even before the cold front starts surging, are going to be fairly parallel to the overall boundary. So here is our initiating boundary right there, and let's take a look at our shear vectors. So even before it starts surging off to the southeast during the early evening time frame, shear vectors are going to be fairly parallel to the frontal zone here. So that is going to allow for a quick transition to a line, and especially as the strong forcing moves in, that is just going to allow things to really congeal into a line quickly, and that is what the HRRR is showing here, especially across Arkansas into Louisiana. And then as we go into the evening hours, that is just a full-on line from Tennessee, even southwest Kentucky, southward all the way to far east Texas, the Texas-Louisiana border there. Very solid-looking squall line there. We do start to see some little beans developing in the open warm sector. Again, I think we'll still see them struggle during the early evening, but the HRRR does have them start to pick up a little bit in intensity by late in the period. Late evening tonight, 10, 11 to midnight or so, we start to see a little bit of bean activity, if you will. Some little supercells there in the open warm sector across southern Mississippi. That will have to be watched closely. The cold front will be, and the squall line will be racing off to the east and southeast there, so not going to give them much time to mature, but there will be enough time and enough warm sector to support perhaps some supercells moving in off the Gulf late in the evening to early morning hours tonight. You see those beans start to take shape. Nice little supercell kidney bean shapes there right ahead of the line before the line comes in and squashes those pretty quickly. Could see an enhanced tornado threat with any supercells that are interacting with the line. That storm interaction stuff could come to play as well there across Mississippi and Alabama this evening and into the early morning hours tomorrow. But overall, the main threat is going to come from the squall line back to the west. Conditional threat for some open warm sector supercells here. The HRRR showing that situation we were talking about, so that needs to be watched very closely. Let's take a look at the ARW model, another one of our cams that we like to use. I'll go back to our southern plains sector to start. All right, here we go. Lots of convection to the north of the front. Storms develop by early to mid-afternoon or so, 2-3 p.m. or so. Quick transition to a messy storm mode, more linear organization of the storms there, and that continues. Very sharp squall line, strongly forced squall line along the cold front there by early evening. This is at 0Z, 6 p.m., and we see that march off to the east. We do see, again, some semblance there. This is at 4Z, so this will be 10 p.m., Start to see some discrete development there on the tail end of the line. Not much room between those little beans and the line, so not going to be much time for them to mature. But if they do develop quickly, they could have that pose that strong tornado risk and damaging wind risk as well. Those continue, and then they kind of merge with the line, and we have mostly a solid line here. So not as much robustness with those prefrontal storms there late in the evening. And they quickly get absorbed into the line, but some evidence at least that we may see some thunderstorms develop there just ahead of the line late this evening, and those would pose the greatest risk for tornadoes, perhaps some strong and damaging winds. But again, the main threat going to be along the squall line, very solid squall line moving off to the east, producing perhaps some significant damaging winds and embedded spin-ups. All right, NSSL WRF model. This will be the last cam we look at here for today. Again, much of the same. Convection develops by mid-afternoon or so. Solid-looking squall line there pretty quickly, and that congeals into a very strongly forced line going into the early evening. Some semblance of development once again. Little beans moving in off the Gulf Coast. Forcing, one thing to note, forcing will maybe remain ever so slightly weaker down here to the south. So perhaps not quite as solid of a squall line down here. Maybe a little bit more room across southeast Louisiana and southern Mississippi and Alabama to support those storms in a little bit more of a discrete phase, but eventually things will congeal into a line, and those develop, as you see, right ahead of the line, and that line will be surging pretty quickly off to the east. So not much room for these storms to work with between the line and the edge of the warm sector, but we do have enough to support that, so that will need to be watched closely, and all the models seem to be fairly on the same page with that. All right, that is going to wrap things up for today. Again, enhanced risk level 3 out of 5 out here from western Tennessee all the way through the Gulf Coast states, southeast Arkansas, northern Louisiana, pretty much all of Mississippi, western Alabama into the western Florida Panhandle, the orange shaded region there, the greatest threat for significant severe weather today. Then we have a large slight and marginal risk surrounding that. Marginal risk extends all the way up into central Kentucky. We talked about the overall rainfall threat going to be the greatest threat there, western Tennessee, northeastward into Kentucky. High risk for excessive rainfall and flash flooding that has already begun with the activity to the north of the warm front there. So turn around, don't drown. Flash flooding will be a significant threat, especially in the red and pink areas today. But severe weather-wise, going to be farther off to the south, especially within the orange shaded region there. Tornado risk is elevated today. We do have that 10% hatched area kind of in a boomerang shape from western Tennessee all the way into the western Florida Panhandle, southwest Alabama, all the way back into Louisiana. Yellow stippled region there. That is the greatest threat for some strong tornadoes. Again, don't think it's going to be a huge, widespread outbreak of tornadoes within the line. But with such strong low-level shear, can't put anything past these southeast systems. So could see some spin-ups within the line. A couple of those could be strong given the degree of low-level shear. And then down here across southern Mississippi, southeast Louisiana, southern Alabama, if we get those prefrontal storms to survive for a long enough time, could see some significant tornado activity with those. That is very conditional at this point, but we do have enough evidence to support perhaps some semblance of prefrontal development out here off the Gulf going into the late night hours tonight. And those could pose a risk for strong tornadoes both ahead of the line and as they interact with the squall line. As those storm interactions take place, that could be a threat for enhanced tornadic activity there, perhaps strong. Damaging winds also going to be a significant threat with this setup, especially in the red hatched region there, western Tennessee southwestward through the Mississippi River Delta region. Greatest threat for significant damaging winds in excess of 70 miles an hour or so, with a broader region for damaging wind potential with the squall line as it moves off to the east. Large hail, not much of an issue today, but an isolated large hailstone or two could evolve later on today. So very potent setup. This is likely to be a decent portion of this event is likely to be overnight after people go to bed. So keep those weather radios handy. Keep those alerts on your phone, whatever source you use. Keep those handy going into the nighttime hours tonight, into the early morning hours tomorrow. and that should help you if a warning is issued for your area. Things could get nasty today, but thankfully there's not enough evidence to support that this is going to be a real super high-end outbreak today. But still, nonetheless, going to be nasty, especially for those folks in the orange shaded region there across the Gulf Coast states and Mid-South. So with that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.